So it was that picks and shovels were again wielded in the forest clearing. The exhumed remains, a total of more than 1,000 pieces of skull and bone, were taken to a Moscow morgue, where the painstaking process of reassembling and identifying the skeletons began. There was an immediate surprise. The murdered were known to have numbered 11, 6 females and 5 males. But the grave contained the bones of only 9 bodies, 5 female and 4 male. It was clear from the skeletal remains that the missing bodies were those of Alexis, 14 at his death, and Anastasia, who had been 17. The claims of identification were viewed with some skepticism, especially as there had been disagreement between the Russian scientists and an American team that had come to assist. And so in September 1992, Dr. Pavel Ivanov brought 9 bone samples to Peter Gill's laboratory at the British Forensic Science Service. Gill and his colleague David Werrett had been co-authors of the first paper Alec Jeffreys published in this field, and had since established the Forensic Science Service as the UK's premier laboratory for DNA fingerprinting. Gill had developed a DNA fingerprinting method using mitochondrial DNA, mtDNA, which, as we saw in the analysis of Neanderthal mtDNA, has a special advantage in cases when DNA is old or difficult to obtain. It is far more abundant than the chromosomal DNA from the nucleus. Gill and Ivanov's first task was the delicate job of extracting both nuclear and mtDNA from the bone samples. The analysis showed that 5 of the bodies were related, and that 3 were female siblings. But were these the bones of the Romanovs? In the case of Empress Alexandra, at least, an answer could be found by comparing the mtDNA fingerprint from the bones thought to be hers with an mtDNA fingerprint from her grandnephew, Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. The fingerprints matched. It was rather more difficult to find a relative for the Tsar. The body of the Grand Duke Georgij Romanov, his younger brother, dwelt in an exquisite marble sarcophagus deemed too precious to open. The Tsar's nephew refused to help, still bitter over the British government's refusal to grant his family refuge at the onset of the revolution. A blood-stained handkerchief was known to exist in Japan, one the Tsar had used when he was attacked by a sword-wielding assassin in 1892. Gill and Ivanov secured a narrow strip of it, but found that over the years the relic had been contaminated beyond usefulness with the DNA of others. It wasn't until 2 distant relatives were finally found that the mtDNA fingerprint was confirmed as the Tsar's. But the analysis had yet one more surprise in store. The mtDNA sequences from the presumed Tsar and his modern relatives were similar, but not identical. Specifically at position 16,169, where the Tsar's mtDNA had a C, that of the 2 relatives showed a T. And further testing revealed only further complications. The Tsar's mitochondrial DNA was actually a mix of 2 types, both C and T. This unusual condition is called heteroplasmy, the coexistence within a single individual of more than 1 mtDNA type. A few years later, the worries of all but the most committed conspiracy theorists were finally put to rest. The Russian government finally agreed to crack the sarcophagus and provide Ivanov with a tissue sample from Georgij Romanov, the Tsar's brother. The Grand Duke's mitochondria showed the very same heteroplasmy as those found in the bones from the pit. Those bones were without question the Tsar's. But what of the legendary Anastasia, whose skeleton was never recovered from the grave in the forest? There has been no lack of pretenders to the Romanov line, and among these none was more persistent than one Anna Anderson, who asserted for a lifetime that she was the lost Grand Duchess. She'd first made the claim as early as 1920 and went on to become the subject of many books as well as the film Anastasia, in which, played by Ingrid Bergman, she was indeed found to be the Grand Duchess. When Anderson died in 1984, her identity was still in dispute. But as the claims and counterclaims of her supporters and critics continued, the means for a resolution were at hand. Anna Manahan, Anna Anderson's married name, had been cremated, making tissue retrieval from her remains impossible. But an alternative source of her DNA was discovered. In August 1970, she had undergone emergency abdominal surgery at the Martha Jefferson Hospital in Charlottesville. Tissue removed during the operation had been sent to a pathology laboratory, where it was prepared for microscopy, and where, 24 years later, it was still filed away. After an appropriately Byzantine series of court cases over access to the specimen, Peter Gill traveled to Charlottesville in June 1994 and departed with a little preserved slice of Anna Manahan. The results were crystal clear. Anna Anderson was related neither to Tsar Nicholas II nor to the Empress Alexandra. But in the wake of such a long odyssey, it is perhaps not surprising that some chose to ignore the DNA and believe what they would. The myth that Anna was Anastasia still lives on. The fate of the Romanovs and Anna Anderson may be the stuff of fairy tales, remote from most of our lives. But DNA fingerprinting is ordinarily applied to grim realities painfully all too close. One of the most awful tasks facing investigators after a violent catastrophe, like a plane crash, is the identification of bodies. For various reasons, to permit the issuing of a death certificate, for instance, the law requires that it be done. And no one should underestimate the desperate emotional need of families to bury their loved ones with proper ceremony. For most of us, respect for the dead requires the recovery of their remains, however fragmented. And this task depends on positive identification. In 1972, an American warplane believed to have been piloted by Michael Blasey was shot down during the Battle of An Loc in Vietnam. Remains were recovered from the crash site, but an inadequate forensic examination in 1978, based on blood type and analysis of the bones, indicated that they were not Blasey's. The anonymous bones were labeled X-26, Case 1853. And in a solemn ceremony attended by President Reagan, they were laid to rest in the Tomb of the Unknowns at